My name is Dale Ecuyer, and I am really passionate about helping families create healthier, happier, and more financially secure homes. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. There's lots of great information coming, and I will see you soon.
All right, we are talking about screen time today. What's too much? Are we using it as like a punishment, a weapon? Are our kids having trouble like disconnecting from it? Is there like total craziness when we say enough? So how can we come to a great resolution in all of this? That's what we're talking about today. Like, how can we resolve this? Because I know it's like huge conflict for a lot of parents, kids and parents. It definitely causes like disruption in the relationship and in the day and all that. So my name is Dale Ecuyer. I love helping families create health and harmony using holistic mental wellness solutions. And I have Adrienne Bishop with me here again today. She's a certified positive discipline parent educator. I have to look at that. Yeah. And a life coach. So she's got like incredible information. Adrienne, like, let's unravel this. Like, let's talk about it. Some of the boundaries that we need to set, like what's going on with the kids, because you were talking about that too, like when they are like taken away from it, and let's talk about that, because that's super interesting to me.
Yeah. So I know, like, yeah, right now, I think people are starting to realize that they've gotten into a pattern of a lot more screen time than they want. So this is why it's coming up more, because while we were on the pandemic, in more involved with being at home and there was no outside activities, screen time was just what we did more than we wanted to. So now that there are more outside activities, kids may be back in school, we're like weaning them off the screen time, and it's really hard. So I think this is really a good timing for this. So a lot of my families that I work with come to me with so many different challenges around screen time. One of them is idea of when we take the screen away, we say, okay, it's time to take it, it's time to stop, or whatever your deal is in regards to taking the screen away or stopping the screen. It could be countdown with a timer. It could be warnings with 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Even if that is the case, a lot of times kids can kick or yell or cry or, hit once you take the screen from them. And there's a little bit of background as to why that happens. That helps a lot of parents understand and have more compassion toward their kids when this happens. So when we're on screens, or when our kids are on screens, there's a balance of dopamine and cortisol that are happening in their brains.
It's a neurotransmitter.
Yeah. So a chemical. So when that happens, they feel really good, right? So a lot of times kids use screen time when they're bored because it makes them feel better. But then there's also the cortisol, which is what you see, like when you're watching a show and there's that like resolution that's not happening. There's a problem that's not solved. Cortisol goes up, especially video games, lots of cortisol in video games. And then what happens is when you abruptly, like, of course, doesn't feel like it's you, take away the screen, then all that's left is cortisol because the dopamine has been dropped. There is no dopamine anymore because there's no feel good chemicals in that, in that situation. So then you have a overload of cortisol, and what it happens is like a stress release, and the kids need to release that stress, and you see these behaviors: crying, screaming, kicking, hitting. So there's like a the brain reason for why it happens. And so I think understanding that is a really helpful way for parents to just have compassion around ending screen time. And so one of the things that I usually recommend is this is a really cool way to do it. Instead of just having the screen time be abruptly ended, you can go and sit with your child for a minute or two and talk to them while they're on the screen. So you can even ask them what's going on in the show they're watching. You can watch the show with them for a minute. You can ask them what they're doing in their video game. That helps pull their brain away from the screen just a tiny bit, enough for them to connect with you. And, for them to kind of get that suction of stress kind of release a little bit early, so that when you do finally take away the screen, it's not this explosion of stress. It's almost like you've gradually moved them out of it, as opposed to making this big abrupt change. And so they sometimes will respond better. And plus the connection with you and you being there engaged helps them to start feeling dopamine, right? So they'll have a little bit more of that dopamine from the connection. And I've noticed that really helps with my kids too. They respond so much better. So that's one thing that I want to recommend is if your kid's really struggling join in on them, join in with them, even play a little bit of video games with them for a few minutes, right? So that connection can create some dopamine.
So true, because you see when you watching kids like on the screen, and I remember years ago, I think my son was maybe 10. He like all of a sudden like pulled himself away from the video game. He sat on the steps and he was just like holding his head like freaking out because he knew he was getting addicted. Like and he didn't like that feeling. And when you see kids playing the video games, it's like they're like possessed. They're like addicted, and it's kind of a scary thing, but you're kind of like totally breaking that brain thing. And I mean, I know all about this brain thing.
Yes.
With the work that I do, but
it's right up your line. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's so brilliant to be like, like connect with them. So you're kind of taking them out of that. I mean, like, it's such a weird,
it's like a zombie state.
It's like they're possessed by it. I mean, I've seen kids do that where they're like completely disconnected from the world around them. That's it. They're just like in this place. So to break that's brilliant. I'm sorry. All right, go on.
Yeah, it works really well.
That was so good.
Yeah. And so another thing is that we actually need to practice this skill of taking responsibility for your reactions and actions around screen time. And since screen time is a privilege, we need to have responsibility surrounding that privilege. So that's kind of what I usually make sure that we balance. Responsibility equals privilege. Okay. So just knowing that, yes, you can have this as long as we are mature, responsible with the screen. So little kids are not going to know how to do that right away. So you want to give them many, many chances to try and to train and to figure out what's the right way to, like, what's the best way to get off the screen. So I definitely want to encourage parents to mention, like, this is something that I expect from you as your responsibility around the screen. When the hour is up, I expect that we will get off the screen calmly and quietly. And we're going to work on that together because I know it's hard for you. And then you can collaborate with your child, even at the age of 4. They still can help you figure out how to solve this. How do you think it would be easiest for you to, get off the screen in a calm manner? How do you think we can make that happen? Should we practice? Should we give them choices? Which should we set a timer and then let them kind of brainstorm with you? And of course, the one connection method is another way to add on. You can add that on to anything. But then just having them kind of understand, like, oh yeah, that does happen. And I want to be calmer when I get off. How can we make that happen? And then almost taking the time to train them. And as young kids, just expecting between ages like 4 and 7, you're going to have a lot more challenging times getting them off the screen calmly. And just knowing that and just having a plan. If they don't get off the screen calmly, what's the next step? And then make sure they know that in advance, right? So you're talking it through with them. So this is the plan. We'll have 1 hour of screen time. And then the next day we will have 1 hour more, as long as you are able to get off the screen calmly. You can even say, like, without hitting or kicking, if you want to be very specific. And we're going to work on that together. But I just want you to know, if that doesn't happen, there will be 1/2 hour less the next day or something like that. You can use it in that way, as responsibility equals privilege. So that is different than what you mentioned about using it as a weapon or a punishment, right? So when it comes to consequences, or I guess punishments, we want to make sure that the punishment is related to the misbehavior or to the mistake. So let's say your child, I actually had a client whose child mentioned that he's just very negative. So he said something really negative about school. Like, I hate school. I don't want to be there anymore. I hate the teacher. Took away screen time. Okay. So as you can see, those two things are not related. So that's not going to really have the effect you want, as in the child stops being negative around school, right?
So logical consequences.
Yeah, logical consequences. Exactly. The logical consequences we want to make sure are related. And if they can't be related, if you can't find one that's related, then you don't use it. You just don't use consequences as the discipline method. So when we are using screen time and we're working on it, we can use it as a logical consequence just because it is related. So if the responsibility of getting off it isn't working as well, we adjust the next day. We get to try again another time, that sort of idea. This works for some kids. It doesn't work for all. I encourage you to experiment with your child because each child has a different level of, I guess, addiction. I don't want to say it that way, but a different level of emotional control around screen, just naturally, right? And once you hit 7, once your child hits around 7, you'll see an uptick in impulse control. And then you can expect more from them. Then you can be a little bit more along the lines of, okay, we need to work through this reaction we're having around screen in order for us to really, be successful in having a regular screen time practice. And they are much better at, they'll take less time to learn it and they take less time to practice it around that age. So those are a couple things that I wanted to mention about specifically, using screen time as punishment. So unless the screen is involved, I don't necessarily think the consequence of no screen time is going to be a benefit. I know sometimes it's hard to not use that because the kids love screen time. So you're taking away something they love, thinking that that means they'll learn the lesson. I don't really teach that in my practice as a way to be effective as to curb misbehavior. I really treat the cause underneath it. So if the child is negative about school, we treat that. We figure out what's going on underneath the negativity. Usually it's some sort of anxiety. Usually it's some sort of fear or nervousness. So we treat it as an emotional challenge. And so then you can address it completely differently if you look at it that way. So that's just a small example. It doesn't have to do with screen time. But when you take away screen time, they literally think you're the enemy. You did this to me. They don't take responsibility for their action of whatever they did, right? They just start to resist you, get angry at you. And that's not really what we want. We want them to learn from their mistakes, I guess. And learning from our mistakes is situation. Yeah.
So the bottom line is having the communication.
Exactly.
And talking about it. And so what is like a normal, I don't know if you can answer this, but what is like a normal amount of time that's healthy in terms of screen time, like in terms of their brains and all that kind of thing? Like, is it better to split it up? It probably is. Like if you have, just, can you answer that? Like what age, what is appropriate for what age, how much screen time is appropriate?
Yeah. So I have done some research on it. So it's not my actual, assessment of the situation. But, if you're under 5, you want to be less than 2 hours. You want to be around 1 if you can a day. Of course, the pandemic has completely blown that out of the water. And if it's been more than that for the pandemic, you just need to have compassion for yourself and move forward. You're going to be fine. But, the recommendations for brain development is this. And then once you're, probably around 5 to 10, 2 hours to 2 to 3 hours is probably max.
So split up though, it should be split up.
It doesn't actually, it really, what I recommend is what works for your family. So for my family, split up works the best. Yes. And then I also have, I try to find values around why I do limits on screen time. So during school, it's nice right now. We're just not doing screen time as much, right? Just because the value that I want to instill is we go out and play with friends when it's nice out, because that's something that's important in our lives. But maybe if it's the middle of winter and it's a pandemic and it's raining and it's snowing, okay, so there's a little bit of a different situation there. But so I think split up for my kids works better. And I think getting off the screen sometimes can be easier in a lesser, if they're only on for an hour or half an hour. I think sometimes, so actually, I don't know if this doesn't really apply directly to parenting, but there is a option for iPads if your kids use iPads to just set a time limit. So you can set a time limit and the iPad literally shuts down. And it doesn't shut down, but it shuts down the specific apps they're not allowed to continue using. So then you're not a part of the end of the iPad. And this has been a game changer for my family, because I'm not the one that's taking it away. I'm not the one that's coming up to them and pulling it from them. It just turns off. So it's a little gimmicky trick, but at this point, it's so much more stress. The stress level is so much lower around it when you use these little time limits. And so if you use an iPad, go for it.
Yeah. That sounds great. And then do they have a warning time? I would think that
5 minutes.
Okay. So 5-minute warning. That's great. I think that's brilliant as well.
Yeah. So that's been a game changer for our family. Obviously you can't do it on the big screen TV, but that's a different, but as long as they're literally just using iPads, you can use that little trick.
So good. So this was great. This was great. Definitely some great tools, great tips on that for sure. And again, like I was saying, the bottom line is communicate with your kid and explain to them why it's not that great for their brain. Like the older kids are going to understand that. They may find that interesting because, like I said earlier, my son realized that he was getting addicted and he was like freaked out by that feeling.
Yeah. I love that because I think that's something that's important. So when your child is on the screen, or later on, you want to say, how do you feel? Really get them to, identify and be self-aware. How do you feel when you're on the screen? How do you feel when you get off the screen? How do you feel when you're, in your day and your brain goes to, I need screen time? Like, is that something that you feel is useful in your life? Is this something you want as a feeling? And just getting them to be self-aware around the screens. My daughter actually, like your son, she's 10. She deleted Roblox from her iPad on her own 2 or 3 times because she was just like, this doesn't make me feel good.
Wow.
And so she was able to do it on her own because we had talked about it and she was able to be open. So it really is important to not vilify it, right? If we vilify screen time, our kids cannot talk to us about it because then we will just go, it's over. We're done. We're not doing it anymore. It's terrible. You're addicted, and just blame it and make it horrible. And your child will feel very confused, right? They love it. It feels so good a lot of the time. And then you're telling them it's awful. There's a middle ground for most kids. There are some kids that can't do it at all, but that's a whole other story. But most of the time you can find a middle ground.
Yeah, that's great. So good. Really interesting topic. And very much, like you said, like on the forefront of every parent today.
Yeah, so hard. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
You can do it.
All right. See you again. Have an amazing weekend, everyone. Thank you again, Adrienne. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.